All right, looks like we are live. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Erasmus Expeditions. Today we are going to be doing episode 9 of the Help Action video series, part of the Life by the Square Inch series here on the channel, where I bring a guest on and we discuss a topic, do an interview, host some questions, and try to give some answers. And today I am very, very happy to welcome my guest, Jeff Doty. We're going to be talking about magic. So, Jeff, you son of a bitch, how are you doing?
Man, I'm doing pretty good, man. How are you?
Doing good, doing good. Had a couple of birthday parties this weekend, actually. One for a friend of mine and then one for my niece. So it's been a pretty busy
Nice.
weekend, but good.
Good.
Yeah. Why don't you give it a little bit of an introduction, tell the people like where they can find you and things of that nature, and then we'll get started with some questions.
Alrighty, sounds good. Yeah, I'm Jeff Doty. I have a YouTube channel. It's called Encounterbalance, where I run most of my games and occasionally do some extra little side content as well. We've currently got a new campaign up on that channel that we're 2 sessions in, going on 3 here in a little bit, called Embers of Light, which has been a lot of fun. It's been sort of a strange experiment in the sense that we built the story and the characters first, and then built the world that we wanted that to happen in around it, so we could get it exactly how we wanted it to feel. And it's been really interesting how it's turned out and felt different than a lot of the other things that we've done. So if that sounds interesting to you, then you can go ahead and check it out over there. Uh, and yeah, hoping to do a lot more with that channel over in a little bit here too. So check it out if you're so inclined, and I'd appreciate it. Oh,
Here we go. Uh-oh.
oh,
Everything good?
hello.
Okay.
Yep, we're good.
No, it sounds really interesting. I've always liked things like, was it Microscope? I've never had the chance to play it myself, but I've listened to a couple of different people kind of run it, and it sounds really, really interesting when they kind of you build as you're playing. That's really interesting to me.
Yeah, it's been nice in a couple ways. It makes it easier, as a GM, especially to kind of know where to guide things because you've already kind of got the idea. Um, and it's been nice for the players too because you can kind of go in ahead of time with exactly the sort of character that would be most interesting for you to play. Of I want to play a high level elf wizard character with a lot of crazy magic. There's a lot of settings where that concept wouldn't necessarily work very well in. It would take some adjustment to make it fit. But if you can kind of take that character first and then say, okay, well, what kind of world do we want that person to be in so that it works but isn't too crazy and all that sort of thing? Was kind of flip the script in an interesting way where you can kind of build to taste rather than have to worry about people's concepts not lining up with the setting or the story not jiving right with some of the characters or all that. It's made it very cohesive in an interesting way.
Yeah, and it's a great way to kind of up the feeling of ownership of your players in the game, which increases investment tenfold. If they can feel like they're not only a part of the world, but they're an integral part of the world, that they're literally shaping and crafting, the world around them as you're playing. That's a good way to get people very involved and interested in the game.
Definitely.
Awesome. Well, I'm looking forward to seeing how that turns out. So, like I said, today's topic is all about magic. And I think to kick this all off, I think we'll talk about the beginnings of this magical journey. One of the questions that I really like to ask my guests whenever they come on is, when and how did you find gaming? How did you first make your foray into the wild world of this hobby?
Yeah, so it's been kind of a roundabout journey for me. So my very first experience with tabletop gaming was with D&D. I don't know if it was second or third edition. I'm not sure which one it was, but my dad uh, was interested and he played Dungeons and Dragons when he was kind of a teenager. So going into adulthood when he had us, that was something that he wanted to do with us kids. Um, so we played some D&D back when I was a kid, me and my older sibling, and my dad who would run it for us. Um, and it was at the point where I was so young that, like, I don't really remember a whole lot of any of the specifics. It was just, like, I remember the feeling that it had more so than any, like, specific mechanics. Like I said, I couldn't even tell you which edition the rules were in or anything like that. I just remember kind of getting immersed and interested in that fantasy environment. Um, and then that kind of fell away, just as things do. We all kind of, as kids got older and, um my dad kind of got further into career and everything, that it became uh, less and less of a priority on everyone's account, and that we kind of fell away from playing that specifically. But that interest kind of stuck with me, and I started playing a lot of games like Baldur's Gate, and especially Baldur's Gate 2. I have logged untold numbers of hours into Baldur's Gate 2. I'm sure I would be ashamed and embarrassed if I saw the total amount that I've played that game, which kind of kept me kind of tangentially interested in the whole world for a while. Um, and then even that I kind of moved away from a little bit, and I kind of just totally faded from the tabletop world, basically all through like middle school and high school, um, until at the very end of high school, one of my super good friends approached and was like, "Hey, I don't know if you even know what it is or if you'd be interested, but I just heard that like a brand new edition of D&D is going to be coming out, and some of my friends were telling me about it. It sounds like it could be really cool." It's like, I have heard of that. I haven't heard of this new edition, but I heard of it like 18 years ago. But yes, I am interested. So we kind of got a couple of us friends in school together, and we just decided that we were going to try it out. We got some players' handbooks, uh, and we tried it out, and we all super really enjoyed it. And we kind of kept going with that group for a while. I ran like a full on campaign for them at some point, and the whole everything. And then I kind of started getting less and less satisfied with the specific way that we were playing. Just like something about it just didn't quite feel like it was ticking boxes for me anymore. And there was just some issues with like scheduling and people not being fully committed. And like, if we're going to be putting in, 6 hours a week to do this, I'd kind of like it to, be a thing that people care about. And that's what kind of got me looking for what else might be out there. I found some of the super basic beginner YouTube channels that everyone, first sees through tabletop gaming. And then kind of grew out of those as I started to find more stuff like the AppTab people and all that sort of stuff, which kind of brought me into the whole online fold. Um, and it wouldn't be another couple years after that until I would start being active in AppTab and actually playing and running in games. Uh, but at least kind of found that area of tabletop gaming for me and was like, "Oh, yes. This is how games should feel." Seeing games like the Provokers and the games like those that I think like so many people in the group found, I kind of like discovered an entire play style because of, and it super clicked with me and was like, "Oh, yep, that's what the other games that I've played in were missing, and this is what I want to do." Um, and that's kind of brought me into AbTab, where I've been running and playing in way too much stuff ever since.
I hear that. Yeah, man, that's awesome. I did not grow up playing. I didn't play until I was probably 14, and so it's really fascinating to hear about people who came into it much younger. Um, and once I started playing, I played pretty regularly, especially once I turned about 19 and I had moved out of my parents' house and got my own game group and stuff started. And from that point on, I've been playing very regularly. And so it's really cool to hear that people had this kind of like hit and miss kind of relationship with it for a while, and then finally kind of found their niche within the hobby, and then dove straight in.
Yeah, I mean it's strange kind of reapproaching it as an adult, knowing it as a kid, because you start to kind of realize how much that you didn't really know what it was about the first time. I mean, it was to the point where basically like I was hardly even making any of the decisions for my character just because I had no idea what was going on. It was just like fun to just sit at the table and watch the miniatures move around and like hear the things that were happening. But it was something like to then come back and actually dive in and kind of grab a hold of like the rules side of the experience. Um, but it's weird how those small things, even if you're not like approaching it in like the right way or whatever, you don't understand the rules. There's like something about the experience of being at a table with other people and doing this that like even if you don't really understand it, can still like spark some sort of unshakable interest in you. So it was kind of what happened, at least on my end.
Yeah, I think a lot of that goes back to, again, it's intrinsic to tell stories. There's something about it that humans need, I think, and there's a lot that can be learned through them, and a lot of social um, needs, I think, that get met by being able to sit around and kind of tell a tale together. And again, usually there's laughter, and people, there's a camaraderie that's usually built at a table, and it's something that I think a lot of people, especially nowadays, are missing because social media and interaction digitally has kind of taken over a large percentage of our lives. So being able to actually sit down face to face, or even virtually like this, face to face, is something that I think we sorely need as a part of kind of our intrinsic being. And I think tabletop definitely scratches that, even if you don't understand it, like you said from the very beginning. And I think there's a different layer of once you start to kind of understand the game mechanics, if that's what you're into, or you get the ability to really start to act in improv and stuff if you're into that aspect. So there's a lot that the game has to offer for a wide variety of different people. Cool.
Yeah, definitely.
All right. Well, let's go ahead and get to one of our talking points. So the first one that I have is that most games that have magic in them usually dedicate like an entire chapter, if not more, specifically to the subject. Now, in your opinion, is it better whenever magic is defined through strict rules, or would you prefer it to be kind of more boundless and improvised in the moment?
So it's kind of a bit of a cop out, but it is my real actual opinion of I think of especially magic, that kind of spectrum of like definition versus freedom. Um, for me, it's kind of a whole like yin yang thing. Is you kind of need both parts of it for it to feel right. Um, because I think if it becomes too defined, then it becomes like exceptionally restrictive and it starts to feel almost like scientific and not mystical of like here is exactly what you can do, nothing else, and this is how it works. Of like that doesn't really feel like you're controlling some crazy, essence that can shape the world. It feels like you're, doing chemistry or physics or something like that, which doesn't really get the right feeling across, I don't think. And it's just not very interesting as a player, I think, to like have your tools be so specifically defined. Uh, where it's like if you can do all this crazy stuff, you can throw fire and teleport and stuff like that, but you can only do it in these specific circumstances. You start to get that feeling of like, but couldn't if I could do that, couldn't I do this other thing with it too? Like, why can't I use the fire to melt the door and only to do damage to the enemy? You know, so you start to lose out on a lot of, I think, realism and also like mystical feeling. If you want to describe it in fuzzy words like that. But I think if you start to get too freeform with it, where you can just like do anything and just like whatever you dream up you can do, um, that starts to get, first of all, it always opens the door up for bad actors, which is always something like if you have a good group, you're gonna pull in the reins somewhat. But I think even with the best of intentions, there's going to be people who want to push the envelope. And if you say that you can do X with it, well, why not Y? And if you can do Y, then why not Z? And then suddenly you're, you know, anything that you want to do, you can do without consequence or conflict because magic, and you can make a way to make it work, which I think is not very interesting either. It starts to just become a fluff tool and a way to bypass events rather than like create events. So yeah, I think you lose some interesting experience there too when it becomes too freeform. It can very easily become too powerful or very uninteresting. Um, I think you need some rules, but you need to you need a. I think where it's at its best is when you have a strong set of rules with space between the rules to stretch. So you can't break out of the bounds of the rules, but you can push and pull from within them. I think that for me is where Magic is at its best.
I agree. I love having the rules behind like a game like Dungeons and Dragons. I like the way Magic is laid out in Dungeons and Dragons for the most part. That's in large part just due to that's what I'm used to, the Vancian system and all that kind of stuff. But there is a certain amount of interpretation that I like to implement as a dungeon master. I like to look at the situation and say, well, yes, it does say technically you can only use this on a creature, but because of the way that you've described the situation, I'm going to let it work. Because it sounds like it should, and it tells a better story. And being able to kind of put the rules in the back seat for a moment is kind of what I prefer. And a large part of that is I think judging player intention. Like, are you doing this like because you're trying to circumvent the challenge, or are you doing this because you think it's the right thing to do in the story and for your character? I'd like to try to take a lot of that into consideration before I make the decision.
Yeah, definitely. And I think you kind of hit a good point there with it too, which is like, is this solving a conflict or skipping a conflict? Because the first one is a lot more interesting than the second one. So, if you have a door and it's made of metal and you want to try to like melt the door, like with burning hands or something like that, um, that's like using a tool in a way. And it's like that spell technically doesn't do that, but you can like find a way where maybe that if you want to use it in the right way that it could. Or if you want to well, you'll have to do it twice to get it to the right spot or whatever. You can kind of make a way up as you go. But I think if you get too far into like freeform magic systems where it's just like whatever spell you want to cast, there's a way to do it. It starts to become a point of like, oh, there's a metal door. Well, I'll just like make it really hot and melt it. There's a whatever. It just becomes a point where you can build the perfect solution because there's not enough restriction on how you can and can't use your magic. Uh, but I think kind of what you described is my sweet spot too. Of like fifth edition magic has a really specific structure, but a good GM will allow you to bend that structure just enough in certain places where you can be creative with it. And I think that's kind of the sweet spot where if you get too freeform, then it's not actually a matter of creativity. It's just a matter of like plugging in the obvious because you can do anything you want with it. So it doesn't matter. You don't have to be smart about how you use your spells or come up with cool, innovative ways to use them because you can always just build the spell to taste with whatever problem you're trying to solve. And you can basically just end up being too powerful, like especially if you're the only one with magic, you just become like a catch-all solution, and everyone else is just like, oh well, we'll just have him cast a spell and do it, which is like not very interesting for anybody. Yeah, you have to walk that line. Too boundless, and you kind of get into that fuzzy territory where anything can be a plausible solution, which is not interesting. Um, But yeah, if you go too hard into the strict rules, especially in something like 5e, then I think you can lose out on a lot of interesting applications of spells that you might otherwise get if you are just a little bit more willing to be free.
I agree. And I think that kind of applies, that kind of thinking applies to all of the rules in Dungeons and Dragons. The rules are there as a structure to be established and then broken and bent when it makes sense to do so.
Yeah, exactly.
Awesome. Okay, so we'll go to one of our preloaded questions that we have here. It is from Lloyd Collins. I did paraphrase this for length. If you play in a high fantasy world, how can that world look even slightly like our own? People can create infinite food and water, fabricate materials, and transmute lead to gold. Do you think about this kind of stuff? Or do you just use magic in your settings the way that it is shown in Faerun, for example?
It's definitely a tough one to tackle because I think I've talked with Lloyd a fair bit about this, just as friends. So I kind of know where he's getting at. Where it's like if you follow the spells that exist in the book and the scope with magic that permeates something like the Forgotten Realms, like the results that the setting actually looks like is not the setting that you would get to if you were to like build from the rules upwards. Like all these spells exist, and all this immense power exists. So like, why isn't it followed through on in the actual setting? Is kind of I think the crux of his question of like, why would anybody ever starve if you can train 5,000 wizards, which you can do in something like Faerun, and just have each of them cast create food once a day and feed the city. Like, why isn't that happening? Or like, why can you walk into a castle and not have every person have dispel magic cast on them and all these like protective wards put up against them? Because if magic is so strong and you know that it's there, then that should like affect the way that people live their lives because it's such a powerful tool and it radically changes the way that like you can live as a person if you have those abilities either as the person who has them or if you're associated with somebody who has them. um so it can be tough, I think, to like follow through on the logical end. um I think there is a lot of degree to which something like Forgotten Realms you kind of just like hand wave it away, of just like, yeah, should the world be different if you follow like the logical application of magic? Yeah, it should. But uh, like it gets to the point where it's so much effort, I think. Um and the place you end up in so alien. It's like if you do, I think, build up ground just from like clerics and wizards and all that exists and you build a logical conclusion to everything that's there, I think the world ends up so insane that it's like no longer a human experience. Where if you take just a little bit of liberty and say like, okay, sure, you could, wish and all this crazy shit in the game, and that would make it way different. But we're ultimately trying to tell stories about people in a way that is both relatable and fantastic. And we like you have to balance, I think, those two elements. If you get too wrapped up in the absurdity of magic, because it is absurd if you follow it to like the full extent of it, then I think you start to lose humanity. At that point, it becomes difficult to play because we don't really know as much as we like to pretend to be other things. We don't really know what it could be like to be, an 800-year-old 20th level elf wizard. So if the entire setting is that level of, crazy, it starts to become very difficult to find a place in it and find footholds to stand on. I do think that at some point you just have to say like, this might not be perfectly logical, but it's better and it's funner as a story and it's more relatable as a person to the world. And like I'd rather have that than perfect logical construction any day. And there are still things that you can do to like take care when you're building the setting to like try to take some of those things into account. It's like an example that I'll give is this Embers of Light game, the campaign that I was just talking about a little bit earlier. Of like, well, why don't wizards rule the world? Was like something that Lloyd asked. If magic exists and elves are the only ones who can do it, which in that setting is true, only elves can cast arcane magic in that world. Then why don't they rule everything? So we decided that like, well, the elven population they don't really reproduce or like hardly ever. So there's like 200 or 300 elves in the entire land and no more than that. So it's like at a certain point when you have humans that just like expand, 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 and you get hundreds of thousands and then millions and then more than that of people, no matter how strong you are, you're going to get outnumbered if those people decide to depose you, especially once humans gain the power to do divine magic, which they can do in that setting, which kind of shifts some of the power balance a little bit. So it's like, and there's also like rules. It's like elves can't use magic to harm people in that setting because of how dangerous magic had been in the past. So it's just like if you use magic to deal damage, no matter what kind, you're gonna face penalties for that, maybe up into including death. So it's like you can kind of build in things as to why magic isn't so dominant. But to be honest, I also think that there's a point of fairness that you can just say of like, I just want all the magic, and I know it doesn't make sense, but I want the world to be like this because I think it's better for what I want to do with it, and I don't really care. Lloyd probably won't find that version satisfying, but not every game has to be the same way. Um, I'd rather have a compelling world that feels right than like a logical world that's like technically built uh, the right way, quote unquote, but ends up in a world that's like nonsensical to play in because of how absurd that it ends up being.
Yeah, I think that's a fair answer. There's definitely a slider that you have to determine kind of the position on for your setting or your game between reality and fantasy. And at a certain point, there is logic that gets a little wobbly in there, depending on where you put that slider. And I think that that's perfectly okay. I mean, again, your dragons would never ever fly, like just based
Yeah.
on their sheer size and muscle mass. Like the wings that they would have to be 3-4 times the size that they're depicted with, and it would look absurd.
Yeah.
But the, you have to not become, in my opinion, you have to make sure that you don't become a slave to the rules or the logic, like you said, of these kinds of arguments. And at a certain point, you have to leave some of that behind and extend your willingness of disbelief and say,
Yeah.
you know, I'm doing it this way, or I'm making these choices because this is the kind of feel that I want from my setting. You know, it's about achieving a means to an end, as opposed to making certain that it makes sense all of the time. Now, again,
Yeah.
that is
There's
a color to preference, you know, kind of
exactly.
thing.
Yeah. And some people do really prefer like a super grounded, super
Mm-hmm.
thought out, logical setting. And I can appreciate that. But you're probably not going to get that with something as high fantasy as like raw 5e is. There's just too much there for it to stay grounded. Like the level of like rebuilding you'd have to do would be so monumental that, and I don't even know that the finished project would be worth the effort anyways. It's kind of the point that I get to. So like if you want a super grounded logical world, that's totally fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But I think at that stage you have to dial everything down. I don't think you can get both where you can have it's insanely high fantasy and insanely high fantasy. Um there's something that I kind of like to say as a little phrase that for me applies. It won't apply to everybody, but for me personally, it's much more important that a setting feels real than being real. Like I'd rather it feel the way I want it to feel than logically exist the way uh, that like is the most realistic. Like feeling to me is so much more important than logic in the tabletop gaming sphere, and that won't work for everybody, but it does for me. So with anytime you get to rules or logic or something like that of a setting, that's kind of always my groundwork. It's like, how does this actually feel to play? Because if it feels real to be a character in the world, then that's already solved it for me. Like that's the important part of like that I can experience the game and connect with it in the way that it's supposed to feel. So even if there's things that aren't realistic, if those realisms would detract from the experience, um, then I don't want them. Like it just makes the game worse for me. And just like a super basic, simplified example of like something like encumbrance of like, does it make sense if you were to like build a logically constructed world that you would have weight limits of stuff you could carry based off of your strength? Yes, it makes total sense. There's no reason why you would be able to carry more or strange whatever. It's just like at a certain point, it breaks down. But encumbrance doesn't feel realistic to me because of all the bookkeeping that it requires. It makes it feel like a game and not like I'm a person in the world. And that's what I want from the game. I want to feel like I'm a character who's acting in the world. And if I have to constantly go and look of like, oh, well, I'm at 78 pounds and I can only carry 89 and this is 10 pounds. So, okay, how will that fit in? At that point, even though it's more realistic, technically, it feels less realistic because of how much it's taking me out of the game. So I think you have to find that line for your group and for yourself of like making sense, but also feeling right. And I personally always slant towards feeling right over being right in terms of realism and magic and everything. It's so much more important to me that the experience is cohesive than that the world logic is cohesive.
Yeah, and it makes a little bit of sense to me in some of the things that I learned in theater with like stage design and things like that. Like you may have a wall that is supposed to be, you know, I don't know, 50, 60 feet long, and it extends into the wings. So it extends past the point where the audience can see. Well, the implication is that it continues on, but you only see what's shown to you, and then there's so much other stuff going on behind there, but it's not designed for you to interact with any more than what is in your view. And I think that kind of that thought process can be extended towards gaming. Like if you want to get down into the nuts and bolts of like the way the world turns, which is something that I used to be a lot more guilty of as a world builder. You know, I wanted all of the NPCs detailed. I wanted every place named. And you don't need that. Like you only need what your audience is going to be interacting with, and maybe just a little beyond that so that you have wiggle room. And I think that's where things like the logic behind how magic would shape the world comes in for me. Like you're going to be playing a wizard. I want magic to feel mystical and like you're tapping into ancient secrets and learning these things that only a few people in the world can do. But if, you know, next door there's a castle that floats and blinks in and out of existence, and then next to that there's also, you know, a volcano that shoots snow out of it because some wizard, like, then what you can do no longer feels mystical and strange and weird. So yeah, I think it's about achieving, like you said, a feeling, a tone, and making the rules work for you to facilitate that end.
Yeah, it's a matter of like only doing what's needed for it to feel the right way. And I think kind of a another good way that that at least I characterize it that works for me of is like scenes and like pacing in like a movie where you basically you cut out everything that's not absolutely necessary, or at least a good movie or a good play. It's all the fat is trimmed and you only see like the dialogue and like the scene transition like as it pertains to the story that's being told. So you can kind of pick stuff like that apart, like with realism too, of like, well, how is their conversation that's so focused when people in real life, when people talk, they kind of talk in circles and they say their sentences weird sometimes. And it's like it's easy to say, like, oh, well, this dialogue is unrealistic. Sure, but if you made it realistic, it would be so much more awkward and boring. Like I don't want to watch somebody like drive in a car for 45 minutes while stumbling over their words trying to talk to somebody else. If I can get the same story beat in 3 minutes with a perfectly flowing conversation. Um, and I kind of use the same logic in my tabletop games too, of like, there's a point where realism doesn't contribute. And if that realism is stepping on the game rather than building it up, where it's taking you away from things that are interesting and constantly distracting and like adding in a bunch of extra tedium, that's like pulling away from what the actual feeling of the game is supposed to be. At that point, it's better left gone. I'd rather have, yeah, a world that feels fun than a world that is accurate.
Yeah, and I think like we do that as storytellers anyways. You take a
Mhm.
romanticized version of what you're telling. Like nobody wants to really play through what it was like to live through medieval Europe. Like nobody
Yeah,
really wants to play what it was like to be a pirate or a Viking or feudal Japan. Like it was awful for the majority of the people. We
exactly.
want to play through a romanticized version of those things. And to me, if you're going to be playing with magic and in fantasy, then there's a certain kind of romanticism that dictates the way that it should go, and that's what ultimately, like, you have to choose how much of that you want in your setting, because fantasy is a very, very varied, and vastly different from one to the other.
Yeah.
So you have to pick where you want that setting to kind of land in the spectrum of things.
Yep.
Yep. So one of the other questions, or the other question that we had preloaded, was from Karen Davies, and she says, in a fantasy setting where magic is everywhere, how do you make it still feel magical? So kind of like what we've been talking about, but like, are there specific tricks or tips in making a person with magic feel special?
I do think that there is some objective trade-off that you have of, if magic is going to be commonplace, then there is some degree to which you have to accept that it will not feel special. And I think that's kind of just step one, is just getting the the tough part on the table and just saying it's difficult. It's if it, because once things become common, then they lose kind of that strange mystical feeling to them. So there is some degree of which the more you add to it, the less it feels important. Um, and that there's a degree to which you can't affect that. So if you want it to be super special and super weird and crazy, then you have to make it rare. That's just kind of, at least from where I come at it from, at a base level. But there are things that you can do, I think, that help magic to kind of feel important anyways. Um, which is to, like, make the way that it's done unique across different things. So, for example, if magic is all over the place, um, each individual person's expression of magic, and the different methods by which it's achieved and executed can still be very different from one another. So if you have, your typical Faerun wizards or something, where you have hand motions and incantations, and then you can bring forth a spell, um, then maybe a different form of magic requires like a very ritualistic, occult sort of, drawing sacred circles and lighting arrangements of candles and, doing certain weird motions. So like the description and execution of each individual spell and aspect of magic, the more that you can give it character and give it its own life, I think kind of helps to differentiate it and make the different versions at least feel special from each other, if magic as a whole is not going to be the special, unique part of it. So like a dark sorceress, might have very weird, strange ways of doing magic where they're like biting into the raw, dead parts of animals and saying weird things and like all this like strange, freaky shit, versus like a very, orderly uh, structure that like a divine cleric might have, where it's very ordered and religious and firm and strong and kind of righteous in a certain way that it's presented. I think the more that you can make each person's magic their own form of expression to them, then I think you start to make that feel special. Where it's not about like magic being special because it's magic, it's about each person's form of magic being special because it's being done in a way that only that group of people or that individual person even can do it. Like by tapping into that, I think you can still make it feel cool, even if it's something that's just all over the place. And everybody could do magic, but everybody's magic is going to be a little bit different from the other person's magic, and you get a lot of character from that.
Yeah, I've done things like where a character might, instead of carrying a spell book around, like their spells are tattooed on their body, and that's how they activate their spells, and things like that. Little tricks to make it feel unique, like you said. And I think as a dungeon master, the way that you could do that, as a game master who's in charge of kind of the setting, is to kind of set things at a status quo. Even if it's high fantasy, even if the magic is commonplace, make a status quo, and then the people in your group who are the heroes who are accessing magic go against the grain, break the status quo. Same with your villains. So that way, yes, magic is commonplace, but this kind of magic, this way of doing magic, is never been seen before. Then all of
Yeah.
a sudden, it's mystical and strange and weird again. I don't
Yeah.
tend to run a lot of high fantasy. I kind of tend to run middle of the road fantasy, between low and high. I think, because I like to have magic. I like magic items. I like spellcasters to be able to step into a situation and save the party at the last minute because of a creative use of a third level spell. You know, I really enjoy that kind of stuff, that use of magic. But after a certain point, it does get to the point for me where it loses its luster.
Yeah.
It doesn't feel special as much anymore when everybody's gotten their eighth magic item, and you know they're, oh yeah, I just got my second ninth level spell, so now I can, you know, make a planet or whatever.
Yeah. Like if you're walking down the street of a town and every person's got their mage hand sweeping their patio for them or whatever, then suddenly the fact that you can do that isn't very cool anymore. It's just like it's normal. Um and like we don't play fantasy games to be normal people, at least not often. Like there's usually almost always some exceptional part to the player characters versus the random guy on the street. So if magic is so commonplace that everybody everywhere can do it, then I agree. I think there's just some sort of inherent loss in um, power to magic when it's common. I think it's I anytime I build a setting, magic is always the exception. Like the fact that you can do magic at all is always an oddity of sorts to the characters because I think it helps to retain that feeling of if you were actually somebody who can do this, how much that would set you apart in both good and bad ways. Of like, it makes you so powerful, but also is incredibly off-putting and scary. I think to a lot of people, and I like my magic to kind of retain that feeling of I don't know what this person can do, and that's exciting when they're my friend, but it's terrifying if they're not. Um, and that kind of element of mystique to it, I think, is really valuable. So when I run games, I'm kind of along your same lines. I like enough magic for it to feel magical, but not so much that it becomes oversaturated and that everybody can do everything all the time because magic is just so easy.
Yeah, and I think like if you wanted to do something where, just taking your same example, where people are using mage hand to sweep, you know, outside their stores, like if you wanted to do something like that, do that for like one town, one city. Maybe it's the city that surrounds a mage tower, and all of these people are failed students of this academy, or whatever. But
Mhm.
like, don't make that, in my opinion, don't make that the way the world is,
Yeah.
because then yeah, I think it's really easy to kind of lose the allure of even being able to cast magic in the first place.
Yeah, it's like
Awesome.
there's not a lot of people like want to like and it's to be fair, it's not like the driving reason, so don't I'm not trying to be too cynical about humans here. But like part of the reason that we learn skills is because it sets us apart from the people who can't do those same things. Like if I want to learn how to play a guitar, like yes, there's a lot of personal validation that comes from learning how to play it, but there's also kind of a lot of like this is something that was really difficult to learn that I can do that not a lot of people can do because it's hard, but I put in the time. But if everybody can play guitar, then it's not interesting. Like you can still use it, it's still useful, and you can probably still find some validation in it personally. But I think there's kind of an element of like it doesn't feel like you've conquered anything to get to that point. Um, and which kind of loses the I think the appeal of kind of the struggle to get to a difficult place and learn a difficult thing because of what it can do. And knowing that you've done something powerful and important by doing that. Whereas if everybody can do magic, then you lose some of that struggle and achievement of like I've done something that's very difficult and I've learned a strange and dangerous art and I've mastered it anyways despite the danger. Like that's I think a very valuable thing to have as a character, and to like understand how and why your character has learned magic for all its wonders and dangers. Um, and I think once you have it be too everywhere and popular, and you lose that. It's like breathing or walking. This is just what people do, uh, and not many people think breathing or walking are all that interesting as general aspects of character. So that's kind of where I end up with it.
Yeah, I think it's a very elegant way of putting it. I want to go back to one of the things that you touched on,
Okay.
and that is one of the things that you do, particularly you, incredibly well, is that your descriptions of spellcasting. And I think that a key ingredient to that is in the art of reskinning. Now, like the power of reskinning goes well beyond just describing your spells in a different way, but I'm particularly interested in discussing it in those regards. So, what are the tenets, if you will, of reskinning magic?
Yeah, there's a lot. But basically, there's a couple things like philosophies that I think kind of fuel my way of thinking about magic that kind of tie in to like the ultimate conclusion. We'll kind of start with some of that. Of So magic um, in a way, it's nothing like anything that humans do, but in another way, it's exactly like everything that humans do. We're in a circumstance. We want that circumstance to be better for us because it suits our personality or our skills or our goals. So we do something to change it to suit ourselves better. Just in the way that you make any change in your life or accomplish any action in your life. It all ties back to who you are as a person and what you want from the world as that person. And magic is basically just a much faster way of achieving that. It's exerting your will on the world to change it to better suit your own desires. Maybe that desire is that the bandit in front of you is no longer hassling you. Maybe it's that you want to get away or get to a certain place quickly or whatever. So it's always a function of personality and goals, for me. So magic is basically just a way of doing that. It just happens to be much more efficient than the normal mundane ways of doing that. So when I think about the sort of spellcaster that I want to play and how their magic is going to look and feel, I always try to basically bring it down to characterize who is this character as a person and like how are they hoping to grab hold of the world and change it, and their like beliefs and their goals are going to shape that a lot. Um, so the way that if you're a very religious devout person, your magic is going to probably take a very defined, orderly style, uh, whereas if you're a very individualistic, sort of hot-headed, get things done sort of person, your magic is going to be affected by that too. So like the magic is just an extension of the personality and the will of the character to take action. So you kind of have to find out who the person is and then kind of shape their magic around that, because that's ultimately what magic is. It's just personality and will made manifest into reality to change it, in a much more vivid way than the mundane means of doing the same thing. Uh, that's always my starting point for like reskinning. Like, who is this person, and how did their beliefs and their personality and their goals shape what they want to do in the world? And then you can kind of build from there. So somebody who's like, I'll take like just an example of like the same basic spell, something like super uh, cliche like fireball. Um, you know, there's the easy way of just the book where you just like you shoot an orange ball of fire and it hits and it goes boom. Um, but if you're um, a cleric, well, we'll use one of the clerical archetypes that can, like I think cleric of the forge can cast fireball or something like that. You know, the way that that is going to manifest is going to be very different from the way that like a warlock who's devoted to a fiend is going to manifest, um, or a sorcerer who's kind of gone their own way with magic is going to manifest. Um, so the personality of the character and kind of, I think like you can use a lot of like tonal theming with the character as well. So something like the cleric of the forge, you can use a lot of forge related spell metaphor of like it's not just that you're shooting a ball of fire and that it's exploding. It's like molten iron that's going to like melt across the battlefield because the invisible divine crucible pours this molten iron onto everybody, because you're a forge person. So obviously your understanding of the world, the way that you kind of grab hold of the world, is going to be related to the things that you have the most experience in. So if that is forging, then the way that you create and manifest your will is going to tie in to forge, because that's how you see the world. That's how you kind of interact with it on its most vivid and detailed level. So you can kind of start to tie into those details of reskinning things like forges, where your sacred flame is, pouring molten iron, and your wall of fire. All those things can kind of tie into those same concepts. Whereas if you're a warlock with Pact of the Fiend, obviously the powers that fuel you are not just your own powers anymore. So then you have to kind of take it the step further and say, well, what's this patron, this personality like that they're giving me this spell? So maybe the smoke comes up and it's in the shape of like laughing skulls or something, and whatever, there's a billion ways that you can do it. But kind of finding those essential personality points and like how the character interfaces with the world in the most detailed levels, their magic is going to come from that because it comes from the same place that they do as a person. Um, that's kind of big step one. Is kind of find out your character's personality and like associations, their skills, like the way that they impact the world the most outside of magic, because their magic is probably going to take a very similar shape to that, because of how important it is to them as a person. And then step two, of like reskinning for me is, and this one's a little bit more mechanical, not literal mechanics, game mechanics, but just sort of, I hope that makes sense. But basically, look at spell effect rather than like spell, um, descriptor. So if you look at a spell in 5e and it says, so I'll use Burning Hands as an example. So Burning Hands says you put your hands out like this with your thumbs touching, and a flat arc of fire comes out from them in a cone out from you. So you can take that as the essential part of the spell, of like the hand motion and the incantation that you have to do. And that's fine. That's one way that you can do it. That can be very interesting. But if you look at the ultimate effect of the spell, fire put out in an area in front of you, if you take that as the starting point, then suddenly you can make it a whole lot of other things that still do the exact same thing. So you could shape a sword of fire and swing it in an arc in front of you. Like, the description is completely different, but the end result is the same, an arc of fire in front of you. So kind of looking at what the spell is doing rather than what the spell is, um, and then kind of building a different cause to get to the same effect. So maybe it's not putting your hands out and shooting an arc of fire, it's swinging a sword made of fire, and that's your Burning Hands. Or you throw a cloud of flammable dust and then you spark it so that it ignites in a cloud. That could be Burning Hands, or so kind of just looking at what the spell does rather than like what the spell is, and then kind of shifting the perspective point of how it gets to that final point. And if you combine those two things, the personality of the character, the will of the character, with the effect that the spell is going to have, you can end up coming to very unique conclusions, where you have magic that is uniquely that person's, uh, and is completely, unique and special, because it ends up resulting in a thing that only they could do, even if the effect of the spell is like functionally identical to another spell. That's kind of the big picture 2-step process of Jeff reskinning spells.
Yeah, that's awesome. And it's funny because like those are exactly the exact same things that I look for whenever I reskin anything, but spells in particular. It is very much about not changing what it does mechanically, and everything else is up for argument or interpretation as far as I'm concerned. Yeah. So you're not looking for a leg up by describing it different. then you can describe it however the hell you want to, as far as I'm concerned.
Yep. Mhm.
And why would I tell you otherwise? Especially if you're going to use it as a means of kind of extending and illustrating your character's personality,
Yeah.
and kind of their shtick, if you will, which
Yeah,
goes
magic can
straight
say a
into
lot, yeah,
yeah,
about
absolutely.
who the person is.
It
So
should.
like yeah, and it should do that.
Yeah.
So I'm exactly on the same page with you. As long as it's not becoming a tool for like advantage, where it's like, but I described the flame arc as a spear, so shouldn't I get some extra piercing damage too? It's just like no, now you've lost me because now you're not using it as a tool of expression. You're using it as a mechanical function of trying to gain points, and deal extra stuff. And that's not, at least for me, what it's about. It's about, like you say, using it as a tool to say, who is this person? Like, I want to know who the character is and how they cast a spell and to what end that spell effects happen can give a huge look into their personality and their worldview and their goals, and even so it should, yeah, use it for that.
Yeah, and I think it's the same kind of situation where when you go describe your character's clothing, the kind of armor or whatever, yeah, you picked studded leather armor out of the book, but how does it look different from everybody else's studded leather armor? Like, you
Yeah.
describe that in order to showcase something about your character. The way that they came across this armor, or, oh, it's covered in black. Oh, they must be, a rogue that does a lot of sneaking.
Yeah.
That's the kind of thing where you shouldn't miss out on the opportunity to use it as a tool to show us, the other players at the table, the GM, the audience, if you're playing online, to illustrate and show us who your character is. It's just like in modern times, like when you step out of the house, deciding what clothes that you're wearing, the way that you're
Yeah.
going to do your hair, the kind of
Mhm.
car that you drive, to some extent, if you've got enough liquid asset to make that work for you.
Yeah.
It's an extension of yourself to some degree. You're choosing how the world sees you, and I think with magic that is the exact same thing.
Yeah. I think Caius in the chat kind of puts it very well and very succinctly. He says, every action or move, no matter what it is, describes your character. And I think
Yep.
kind of the more you can kind of build that into your mindset of like, there's there's no extra or unnecessary things that you do. Like everything that you do, no matter how much you think it does or doesn't impact, is also a statement about you and how you think and how you act. Um, and the more that you can make that a part of everything, like you say, like with your armor, of like, oh, well, his armor is like no frills, solid dark colors, so it's probably used for stealth. Versus if you have like jangly decorations and stuff, like he doesn't care about stealth. He's probably like a warrior. Those might be decorations or like intimidations or something like that. Like every choice that you make about your character is an opportunity to say who they are. And I think the more that you can show who your character is, the less that you feel like you need to say what your character is. And I think the former is much more valuable and interesting. Like if you have to tell me that your character is a rogue, um, then you probably could have described the character better, either in either description or action, because you shouldn't need to say that you're a rogue who's specifically about sneaking. That should be obvious by the way that your character looks and acts. And magic, I think, is just the next level extension of that. Of every spell that you cast is also a painting that you paint about who the character is. And the more that you can show that in how you describe the magic, uh, the more vivid and impactful the character is. And that's how you can get some of the characters and players in the game who are extremely memorable with their magic, is because it's never just a spell, it's a spell and a statement and a picture about that person, which I think is, it takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of like effort to do, but I think for me, especially, undoubtedly, it's always worth the effort. I never have. I've played a lot of spellcasters in a lot of games, and not a single time have I ever felt like I could have just not done that and it would have been as good. Like it's always worth it. Like I've never regretted putting in the time to to think about spell descriptions or character portrayal in that kind of sense because of how much that it can change and impact the character and the game as a whole.
And then I agree 100% with what Caius has said, except for one word I would change. Every action or move should describe a character. I would change to every action or move does describe character. So
Yeah.
if you are doing your actions and your dialogue and things and your descriptions, and you're not spicing them and you're not adding stuff to them, then your character is going to come across as unoriginal and dull.
Yeah.
So it's going to do it whether or not you want to put in the effort. And if you put in the effort, it's just going to make your character better.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Especially, I think with tabletop games, especially, it's like in a movie where you can like see the person, like a lot that kind of is not up for dispute. A person does look this way and talks this way and acts this way because you can definitively see every part about that, and you can see what they do well and what they do like poorly. But that all ties into something that's like indisputable in some sense. I think in tabletop sometimes it's easy, and this is getting a little bit off of like Magic specifically, but I think it's like worth saying. Um, of like you can build a character a certain way in your head, and you can imagine this person, and they're this like super vivid, charismatic, dramatic entity that you see in your own head as the person who made it. But like the character isn't always what you see in your head. Even if you're the person who's playing them, if you don't portray that, then the character isn't that. So even if you think of your character as being super charismatic, if you don't speak well as the player, then you may think of them as charismatic because you see that in your own head, but nobody else is going to see that. They're going to think that this person is kind of a stumbling over their words, and if that's what's going to come across to them. So I think you're right on the nose. If everything that you do and don't do speaks about who your character ends up being in the actual world, and sometimes what they end up actually being is not always what you want them to be in your head. You kind of do have to put some time into making sure that they're everything that you actually want them to be, um, and finding those little bits of portrayal, especially in something like Magic, can do a lot to make sure that everybody sees the same person that you see when they hear your character's name. Um, and the more that you can show that through the actions of the character, and the way that their magic appears, the less that you have to like say it and hope they believe you, because it'll be indisputable by the actions of the character and by the way that you put it forward.
Yeah, that's very, very well said. Okay, bringing it back more specifically in the direction of Magic. In Dungeons and Dragons, just specifically as an example, there's a large chasm between arcane and divine magic, though mechanically they're really not that dissimilar. So how do you make that division feel adequately defined? Or is it something that you bother with?
So I think the mechanical distinction between divine and arcane in the sense of rules, so like wizards, bards, sorcerers, warlocks versus clerics, paladins. Uh, I don't know if druids might be in their whole own category. I'm not sure, at least in fifth edition, where that falls. Um, I don't think that is, at least for me, I don't find that line very interesting as being the one that you look at. Um, I think it's much more interesting in terms of defining magic as defining it by its source rather than by its mechanical function. So, divine magic, I think a lot of people kind of think of as being like very orderly, very bright, very, like sort of shining golden light of healing or whatever. Which, if you're like God is a god of order and healing and light, then it makes sense that the magic is going to be like that. But divine magic done by a god of chaos and death is not going to look like that. Whereas, like a wizard school of evocation might be orderly and bright in the same way that a divine god of light would be orderly and bright because it's very academic and like planned. So it's like I find it much more interesting to look at like the source of the magic and how that source influences behavior. And it's just like it's the exact same aspect of like personality of the character influencing magic, just like kicked up the next step back. Like, how does that god's personality or domains impact the magic? Because that's I think going to be a lot more interesting than like separating a cleric from a wizard is like interesting, but it's not interesting in the sense that like the magic itself is mechanically very different because like you say there's kind of a very small amount of mechanical distinction, but the more that you can kind of create differences in all the aspects of magic where again, a fireball cast by a god of light is going to be very different than fireball cast from a god of death, even if they're both divine, versus a fireball cast from a studied academic wizard is going to be very different from a raw, untrained sorcerer. But like nothing about that is like specifically, explicitly on the line of divine versus arcane. It's all about like function, personality, and source. I think that for me is a lot more interesting of a distinction than specifically trying to separate arcane magic mechanically from divine magic mechanically, because you can kind of separate it at the source level. And I think it's kind of an oversimplification to say that like divine magic is a singular entity and arcane magic is a singular entity. When even within either of those sides, you can have such a gigantic difference in the spectrum of how those things differ, you know? So it's like it kind of becomes a point of like, well, where do you end up drawing the line of distinction? If you're gonna draw a line between arcane and divine, are you gonna draw a line between evocation and conjuration? Because those are two radically different forces. So is it fair then to say that those should be defined? And it's kind of you can kind of have this infinitely fracturing, segmentation of magic. And at some point you just have to say, like, what's worth separating out and what's not. I think kind of going back to the stuff about spell descriptions and kind of the way that that influences, I think is a lot more interesting, at least to me personally, than trying to find some distinct way in which it's like mechanically different, unless it's like very, very important to the setting at a core level that those things are very different. Um, and if it is, then by all means. But at that point, I think you're probably looking at building a different system and not just like changing 5e. If you want divine magic and arcane magic to be radically different entities, because in 5e they're just not set up to be that different. So you have to find other ways to make them different. But I don't think that's arcane and divine. I think that's like all across the board. Personality, source, will, goal, all of that is going to define it already. I don't think you need to do extra work when that already says enough about what you do.
Yeah, I currently run a campaign that is set in kind of an Arthurian based setting, and so I did put in caveats about there being a pretty heavy distinction, societal distinction between arcane and divine. Now, rules wise, whatever, you play whatever, but these specific schools of arcane magic are considered by the people that you're going to be interacting with, even your characters, they're considered to be black magic. They're off limits. If you're caught doing them, people will likely report you and or hunt you down and burn you at the stake, because it's such an intrinsic part of the feel of that setting, and capturing the way that it feels to live, the way that I imagined it would feel to live in that kind of a society. It becomes an important part of the storytelling. So if that's not the case, then yeah, I absolutely agree. I don't know that there should be much of a distinction other than just, what it specifies in your class, but yeah, it's definitely much more about how you describe things. The way that it comes down, like you said, the source, I think, is probably the most important thing to consider. Like, where is that magic coming from? How are you being able to manipulate reality? What's allowing you to do that? It's a great way to put it.
Yeah, I think you bring up a good point too as well about like there's a difference between mechanical distinction and like cultural setting distinction, because I've absolutely used and played in a lot of settings where exactly like you say, even if the cleric and the sorcerer are kind of doing the same thing, people are going to look at that very differently. Is where one is a divinely inspired person of God or whatever, in the setting, and one is, a defiled heretic witch who's, bewitching people unduly or whatever. I think you can cut across that line, I think, and it can be very useful and very interesting. Even if the mechanics there are practically identical, the social and moral implications are not identical, and that can be a very useful way to shift things in a setting that can make it feel very evocative.
Excellent. And while we're on this topic, I actually had a question for you. And then we get to a couple more questions that have popped up in chat. So based on conversations that you and I have had before, I know that you had a fairly religious upbringing. Now, at large, one of the biggest issues that a lot of religious groups have had with fantasy gaming is magic. So is this friction something that you encountered at all growing up? And if so, how did it color your approach to this once you started gaming?
So, the answer here is not particularly interesting because the basic end result is it mattered exactly zero to me throughout the hobby. Um, so I grew up in kind of a what you would call a Christian household, um, but I'm fortunate in the sense that my parents have always been very much on the lines of like religion is a personal journey, not a system. So it's much more important that what you do follows what you want it to be rather than, being part of like a structural systemic construction in the sense that like a hard line, like what you would think of as like a Christian would be.
Spirituality
So
over dogma.
yeah, so it was always very much not an issue because it's like, well, you know, I don't believe that magic is real and is evil. So it doesn't impact me at all to explore and express those things in games because they're games, they're not real. Um, and those things don't have sort of a big impact on our character in that way, in the sense of like affecting moral judgment. Um, I think it's kind of a false sort of jump to say that like because you know express interest in occult things in a game that's going to somehow pull you away morally in life. Like I don't really buy into that. Um, and my family never did either. And like I said, my dad was the one who brought me into the tabletop gaming world. So it was never really a thing for me. Um, I did. I I have known some people, and I've definitely seen some of the force of that end of things. Of like, no, these things are bad, and these things influence us in a bad way. Um, but it was never anything that I or my family ever gave stock to. It's just like, yeah, those people are living their own life. I don't agree with them. They're entitled to live how they're gonna live. Um, I, I'm not gonna do anything to stop them, especially at that point when I was a kid. Um, so these sort of like blend between like in-game spirituality and like real life spirituality has always been very distinct for me because of that, of like not ever really considering it as like this is something that's breaking the rules of a thing that I'm a part of, because that was never really part of my religious identity even as a kid, of like this is a thing that I'm a part of and I need to like fight the fight as a member of the group. Like I never really had that mentality when I was religious, and even now that I'm like no longer associated with the church or anything like that, it's just that was never a part of my identity as a person. It was never like very important to me that I was like a warrior for the cause, where I had to fight to make sure that things were good and right or whatever. Um, so it never really had much of an impact on me as a tabletop player. Um, in fact, I think if anything, like the really all that it's done is kind of provided a different angle for expression of magic and religion in game, because I kind of know what some of these religious structures, at least in modern day. Obviously, modern religious order is very, very, very different from medieval religious order. So they're practically even incomparable. But there's plenty of research that I've like done into Christianity and into like different expression of like religious and occult magic because of my previous associations with those things that have now kind of flavored the way that I can use them in character and in the game. So if anything, it's only had positive impacts because of the extra experience and kind of knowledge that it's pushed me to get rather than ever having any sort of negative ramifications on me in or out of game.
Yeah, I've never personally been very religious, but I've always been very spiritual, and
Mm.
I enjoy a lot of the aspects of theology. I love the thinking that goes into a lot of it. Even if there's a lot of it that I don't personally buy into, it's almost
Yeah.
always intriguing to hear someone out,
Mhm.
and hear their descriptions of why things are that way in their mind, or how this unexplainable phenomenon might have come about, especially whenever you start talking about ancient cultures and ancient religions, when
Yeah.
when people did not understand as much about the world and the universe around us as we do now. There's a lot about it that is just so powerful, because things were done from mythological standpoints. These larger than life heroes and monsters and events that occurred, and that's the
Yeah.
bread and butter of like what we sit down to do whenever we play these games, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think there's a mindset that like in a way, like I'm not religious anymore, basically at all. I wouldn't consider myself religious. But there's a certain part of that mindset that is still very appealing to me, even if I don't believe in it anymore. Of that whole idea of like, we're not just people doing things, we're like warriors for the religious cause, where like every action is not just an action, it's also a statement on morality and a battle against the people who live in other ways, like to push the world towards being right. And that mindset, while I don't think is personally, I don't find it valid in reality. I'm not going to get into that whole thing here, but it's a very powerful thing that if you understand in a way that like if you've been a part of it, I think you can understand it in a better way than somebody who's just trying to portray it. And that mindset, while not very applicable for me in real life, can be a very powerful thing to touch into in a role playing game of tying into that like pure power of belief and like the fact that every action has moral implication and like everything that you do or don't do says something about your relationship to your deity and the life that you live and the implications it has for your future both during life and after you die. Like those are all things that you can bring into a cleric in an RPG to like really bring a lot of power to them. um, and it can say a lot about who that person is and why they do the things that they do. Uh, and the more that you can kind of make that realistic of like, well, because it's so easy to like portray, I think clerics as just like outright like robots for God, where it's just like they just do the thing that they're gonna do with no questions or fears. It's just like this is how I must act because my God says this is how I act, and like that's the end of the story. But like even the most devout person, at least in the experience that I've had talking with people while I was religious and afterwards, people talking with people who still are religious, like that can have a big impact. Like, is you always want to be faithful, but it's difficult to like keep that up all the time. And I think like knowing how it feels to be devout but struggling is a very unique feeling that somebody who's never been religious won't necessarily understand. I think that can add a very big element of realism to something like a cleric, where your understanding of like devoutness is colored with a little bit more nuance because you kind of know what it's like to present devoutness without necessarily feeling devout. Like that's going to impact the way that the cleric acts and the way that the magic of the cleric portrays and the relationship to their god and all those sorts of things. Um, I think it has helped me in some regard there of like it's never negatively impacted my understanding of magic or tabletop experience, but it has kind of I think given me some insights into some of those mindsets that other people don't have if you've never kind of grown up in that environment.
Yeah, I have known a couple of friends growing up who were extremely religious, and some who are not as much anymore. And I remember being just being on the the wings, if you will, of their crisis of faith, and
Yeah.
that's a very fundamentally stirring thing to go through as a person. And I think, especially in a world like is often depicted in Dungeons and Dragons, where you're seeing cataclysmic events sometimes happen,
Yeah.
or where yes, your god can grant you powers and things of that nature, but so can that guy's god, and so can her god. And
Yeah.
how do you maintain your faith if you can see the power of all these other gods going on around you and possibly even outperforming what you can do?
Yeah.
And I think all of those kinds of things are things that absolutely should be depicted in the life of a divine spellcaster.
Hmm. Definitely.
Awesome. So we have two questions that have been posted in the chat. Thank you, everyone who has been watching today. These two questions are from Caius, and we'll go ahead and tackle the first one. Do you think rims? Good Lord, I almost made it through the whole thing. Do you think rhymes or spoken incantations are a valuable part of spell description? How do you avoid becoming corny?
Oh God. There are people who can do that really well. I don't think that I'm one of them. Uh, where I think kind of like touching into, for me, the times that I've seen it best is when it's more evoking the feeling of like incantations or other languages rather than like actually fully reciting a thing. Um, where they'll like speak in a foreign language and they'll say a couple words that kind of evoke a feeling of that language or that structure, rather than like actually saying a full on piece that they have to do. Um, it's one of those things that for me, I haven't found that it's like I've never done it, and nor do I plan on really making it a part of what I do. Um, but it's like anything, execution is going to be king over concept. Where I think if you're going to do something like that, you're going to use like incantations and rhyming structures or whatever to cast your spells. Like you either have to know full well that it's gonna be silly and just accept and make it silly, um, or you have to just like do it with utter conviction and like absolutely not a single shred of irony. Like practice and nail it because I think like anywhere in the middle, it's probably gonna come across corny. But there's a certain power I think in authority over something like that, where if you say it and you say it with like absolute certainty that it's going to be rad, then it might end up being more rad than it otherwise would be. But I think it's not going to be something for everybody, and you have to like really make sure that you do it well and with taste, or else it's going to come across as being pretty poor. It's one of those things that it's extremely difficult to do well and very easy to do not well. So you have to watch which one you do. For me, yeah.
Yeah, I think I agree. A large part of it depends on setting. Like I run a setting called Downland, which is kind of like a fairy tale mixture of like Oz and Wonderland, but kind of made dark fantasy.
Yeah.
So for that kind of setting, to me, rhyming incantations would fit very, very well, especially if
Yeah.
the rhymes were like dark nursery rhymes kind of
Yeah.
thing. I would eat it up with a spoon. But I think I agree most with what you said about being good at it. Like you've got to practice it. Like if you're
Yeah.
going to say a phrase, an incantation in different language, like make sure that you can pronounce it so that you're not tripping over the words as you're reading it off of your character sheet. And I would keep it short. If you're going to do this lengthy description, do that the first time that you cast it, and then have a different version that you're going to do every other time that you cast it, because otherwise it's going to get very old very fast.
Yeah.
For everyone else.
That's something that just came into my mind. Like right as you started to say it, I thought the exact same thing as well. Of like, if you do this, then you're gonna have to either do it every single time, or come up with a good reason as to why you've done it once, but all the other times you didn't do that. I mean, obviously you could just describe it as like, and then I say the same thing that I said before. But even like having to put that interjection in, kind of like adds a very weird caveat to it all. Of like, if this is what you're gonna do and you're gonna make it important, then you're gonna have to do that. Like, it's gonna have to become a part of the character, where every spell that you cast is gonna have to have something that you say or do as part of it. Um, or else it kind of lends to that inconsistency of like, why did you put so much effort into one time, but not another? Um, and it can become very difficult, I think, to keep that up in a way that's always interesting, because one like badass incantation for one important spell, I think, could lend a lot of power to that moment. But if every time you cast a spell, every single fight, every single rest, every single everything, you're constantly throwing in your little chants and your little rhymes, like I think that's going to start to wear a lot. And not just on you having to keep all that preparation and effort up, but on everybody else who has to start sitting through that, and it starts getting less cool and more tedious. Of like, oh, he's casting another spell. Guess we gotta sit here and listen to his thing again. So if I were going to do that, I'd save it, I think, more for not just like day to day spells, but like rituals of import in some way. Like if you have a specific like not, like you're not just casting cure wounds or whatever again, but it's like an important moment in the game where you're doing a ritual that's kind of bigger than the typical spell that you're going to cast, and you want to like prepare like a Latin chant that you do because you're playing a cleric who's kind of very based in that. Like that could, I think, lend a lot of power to that moment as a special moment, but not, I think, as part of everyday commonplace spell casting, because that, like you say, like that gets very old very quickly.
Yeah, and I think one of the traps that a lot of people who play spellcasters fall into, and I've done the same thing, is you tend to look at spells like you look at ammunition. It's like, I've got so many left, and I'm just going to fire them out until I'm done, and then I've got the smoking gun in my hand, and I'm going to have to fall back on something else. But in reality, like the way that it should feel is that each one is an individualistic encounter. You're either asking a prayer from a god and having it answered, or you're making a pact with a dark being from beyond who's answering the call, or you're manipulating physics beyond the normal realm of capabilities. There's each one of those situations should feel somewhat individualized. You don't have to go to a long explanation of how it's different, but as in your mind, it should be an individual experience. And when you have something special, like you're talking about, maybe it's a funeral or somebody's on death's door, and this Cure Light Wounds spell is not simply just I need to top off the fighter so that he can get back into the fray. It's, I'm saving this person from dying. So use those moments as
or like if you're using your one diamond to cast the first and only raise dead spell of the game, where the fighter did die and you're bringing them back to life. That's when you can like pull out all the big guns and like really make it a powerful moment. Like exactly like you say, like pick and choose your battles as to where and why you use that sort of thing. Because if you used it in that sort of moment, it could be the coolest moment of the game, even like if you do it well. But yeah, it's all about knowing. It's just kind of following what's important to the story and the feeling of the game, and like heightening those moments. And if you can heighten it with a bit of incantation or like a memorized pattern that you have to say, then like that can be really cool in those moments. But it has to add to a special event, uh, not an ordinary one. Yeah.
I agree. Okay, we have one last question, it looks like, and also from Caius, touching again on the divine versus the arcane. Have you played games where divine and arcane magic is distinct? Could you tell from the description that it was a clerical dispel magic rather than an arcane dispel magic?
Um, so I'm gonna cheat a little bit here and say yes, I have. But so it was in Iskloft, which I think is a little bit of a different scenario than like typical uh straight 5e. But I think that setting has done a really good job of like making them feel exceptionally different. Where you have like in a campaign that I'm playing right now in Iskloft game, I'm playing a Galder, which is basically like a rune mage. So they've learned the runes of the gods and can inscribe those runes to bring about fantastic effects as a result of that, of like understanding. And then there's also like Saith Kona, which are basically like witches, like your typical sort of like old world, you know, dark, strange, weirdness, spooky stuff. Um, so I think like in a setting like that, it's very, very obvious like when I cast a spell versus when one of the others cast a spell in that game. Because like the feeling and like kind of like what you were saying with your Arthurian game, where like the implication of one versus the other is so radically different socially that like you can't help but make them very different. Where uh, the runes in Iskloft are very much like a holy thing, something to aspire towards and revere as part of the gods. It's something that like Odin has brought down to man. So it's like almost a holy. It's like almost a cleric in a lot of ways, where Seth Kona brings their magic for much darker, scarier things that aren't understood. And that can have a lot of scary implications. And there are even entire cultures that like despise and like seek out to kill people who practice witchcraft, as it were. I think like in settings like that, where it becomes very obvious, it's very easy to make those things distinct. Um, as far as just like general 5e games, again, I'm gonna kind of fall back to what we were saying before on the arcane divine thing. Like I've seen dispel magics that were very, very different from one another. But like what makes one sound arcane versus one sound divine can mean a lot of different things based off of even which specifics that you do. Where like a god of magic and like a clerical god of magic, your dispel magic is going to be very, very different from a clerical god of healing or a clerical god of death or a cleric's god of chaos or something like that. So like if you can't even necessarily tell between those descriptions whether it's divine or arcane, I think the distinction starts to become a little non-important because like any one of those cleric dispel magics, you could count as one or the other based off of like the way that it's described. But like I think ultimately like the source is more impactful than like which side of the either or uh, line that it falls upon. And like tapping into that is I think going to be more valuable than just making it sound um, divine versus sound arcane because there's like I said before an entire spectrum on either side of those lines that will be radically different from one another even still. Uh, so I'd rather it be unique to that character and say something about them as a person, their understanding and their belief and their personality, than it to like sound divine versus sound arcane in that sort of way. That's just kind of where I fall on it.
Yeah, I think for me, something that kind of denotes a divine feeling with magic is that the the fact that it's generated through prayer, that it's the offering up of a plea, a hope to a being that is external of yourself. And I think that that's usually very obvious, in my mind at least, with most divine magics, that you are seeking a source outside of yourself to grant a personal favor or a boon for you. Whereas most arcane magic seems to be a lot more internal. Even with a warlock, in my imagination, the pact between a warlock and their patron is very much a personal, quiet relationship usually. So it's a lot more of an internal understanding of how to access your powers and your magic. Whereas with the divine magic, it's a lot more of a, would you please do this for me? And then it kind of is bestowed onto you as opposed to it coming from within.
I mostly agree, I think, with that, but I think there is even room within divine magic to kind of walk that line of like, I think there's kind of like the two, like if you want to like separate divine people into like archetypes that are like broadly way overgeneralized archetypes. There's something like the priest sort of figure, which I think is very much exactly like what you described. I think you like the nail on the head. It's like asking for something to happen from the god to help you, and it's not necessarily brought about by you. You're asking for help. I think there's also like a separate sort of archetype that you can fall into, which is like the crusader sort of figure. Just like, my God has given this to me, and now it's mine to do to make sure that his will is followed. But even those things are going to feel very, very different from one another. Of like, are you a cleric who's, trying to help and ask for assistance, or have you been gifted a power that it's now your responsibility to use to act as an enforcer for the god rather than like an intermediary for the god? Like, there's, I think, even a whole range within divine magic of separating that out between that sort of like priest versus crusader, super broad archetypes that you can kind of start to tap into with that make even those very different from one another, and it kind of cascades infinitely down.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. Cool. Well, we've gone through all of the talking points and questions that I had picked for this, and we've gone through all of the questions that have kind of come up in the chat. So thank you very, very much for watching. If you've watched, thank you for watching later on, for sticking with us and hearing us talk about magic. And I would like to say thank you, Jeff, very much for coming on. Whenever I started thinking about things that I wanted to have you on the show to discuss, it really came down to only one choice as far as I was concerned. Because again, I've played in a lot of games with you where you have played spellcasters, and you always knock it out of the park with your descriptions. And yeah, I mean, this conversation has done nothing but concrete my opinion in the matter. So I appreciate very much you coming on.
Yeah, I really appreciate you asking. It's always very nice to like put a lot of effort into like thinking about something, and then like have somebody reach out and like ask to like talk about that thing. Like it's always a very nice feeling to kind of know that the effort is not misplaced and that it has led to something. And it's always if there's anybody in the community that I'm gonna enjoy just sitting down with and talking shop with about, it's gonna be you. And so once I saw this series, I was very excited and hopeful that I'd get my chance to step in and help out, and it did not disappoint. I had a lot of fun with this, and hopefully some of the stuff that we've gone over has been useful and or interesting. That's always the goal with this sort of thing.
Absolutely. And I think there's a very, very good reason why you and I started Dudes of Yore, as the podcast, which you can also find on YouTube if you guys want to check it out. If you liked today's discussion, I highly recommend that you do, because it's more of this exact same shit. But yeah, you and I converse very, very well with each other. It's a very easy, natural conversation that goes back and forth. And I think we both tend to arrive at a lot of the same opinions on things, and we tend to come at it from very different angles a lot of the time. So it's very refreshing to discover that. And I know that I've learned a ton from you by playing with you, but also in having these kinds of discussions with you. So
Yeah, absolutely. Vice versa.
Awesome.
Yeah, it's I think there's a very nice point of like overlap where we see eye to eye on like most things. Like we have a very similar approach and interest in, and there's like a couple things on the outside of that that kind of provide some interesting back and forth. So it's always very, very interesting. But yeah, I'm right there with you. It's always a good time.
Excellent. All right. Well, everyone, Thank you once again, and until next time, may your dice roll high and your snacks always be within reach.